Well, hello again. Welcome to Mark the Text. This is where we mark up the text of our Bibles using some of the tools that come from the Australian Fellowship of Evangelical Students. Every December, we run a conference called the National Training Event. And in Strand 1, all the strands are great, but I love Strand 1. And because I'm a visual person, I love the idea of marking the text up. And you could do that with pen and paper or just in a Word document. I'm going to do it here on the screen. And today we're looking at Daniel chapter 4. And there's lots of things we could be marking up and should be marking up to understand this passage well if we're really studying it, not just reading it quickly. Today we're going to look at some of the obvious markers in the text, and particularly when, issues of time in the passage. And what we're going to see is that by noticing that, it really helps us with the progression. In this passage, time is a really helpful marker to see what the writer is saying to us and what's going on in the story. So let's come over. We're not going to mark everything in the text, and I'm not even going to read the whole passage because it's a long chapter and the video would be really long. But here's Daniel chapter 4, and let me just show you a few things about the time. It starts off, King Nebuchadnezzar, he's speaking, "To all the nations and peoples of every language who live on the earth, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you." Right? It is my pleasure to tell you. And what I want you to see here is this is present tense. This is something that he's doing now. It's my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that God Most High has performed for me. And then we go on. And what happens is at verse 4, we get a bit of a break. "I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous." I was at home. We're now in the past tense. We're having a little bit of a flashback. And as it goes on, we find out that he has a dream. It's a dream that terrifies him, so he calls in all his experts. They can't interpret the dream. Daniel is called in, and this is what he says. He tells Daniel about the dream. "In the visions I saw while lying on the bed, I looked," and so on. And it's about a tree that's cut down and kind of humbled. And then, here's a little time word, then Daniel is perplexed. But he knows the interpretation of the dream, but he's worried about speaking it out. He says, "My Lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies and its meaning to your adversaries." And he gives the interpretation, the tree you saw. He gives the interpretation about how Nebuchadnezzar is going to be humbled. And he even gives some advice. He says, "Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue." But look at verse 28. "All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar." When did it happen? 12 months later. So we've got another jump in time. We went back to where Nebuchadnezzar had the vision and it was interpreted. Now it's 12 months later. It's 1 year later. And all these things happen. Nebuchadnezzar is proud. He talks about Babylon, that I have built as my royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty. Here's another time reference. "Even as the words were on his lips, it happens to him." And immediately what had been prophesied takes place. It was fulfilled. He was driven away and his mind becomes like that of an animal. It sounds like he's having some sort of mental illness or breakdown. Another time reference in verse 34. "At the end of that time." So something else has happened here. We went back to the past. Then 1 year later, he was being very proud and it was fulfilled. This is at the end of that time. Now, the prophecy had been that it would be for 7 times, maybe 7 years, 7 periods of time anyway. And at the end of that time, at the end of the 7, he raises his eyes towards heaven and his sanity is restored and he praises God. Listen to this. At that same time, as his sanity was restored, his honor comes back, his splendor, the glory, the kingdom, all comes back to him. And so now I am praising and exalting and glorifying the King of heaven, he says, because everything he does is right and his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. And so what do we see here? If we zoom right out, it's such a long passage. Boy, hard to even get on the screen here. But what we're going to see is that the time has really helped mark these things out, right? These were our big breaks. We begin in the present. We could call it now. And he's praising God. And we end in the present now. And so this is like a movie. Some movies these days, they start kind of at the end of the story, and then they have a huge flashback to the beginning, and you work your way through the film until you get to the present time again. That's what's happening here. We start in the present now, and then we have this, if it was a movie, we would call it a flashback. We have a flashback maybe to 8 years ago, right? When he has the vision, the dream, and it's interpreted. 12 months later, so 1 year later, we're now 7 years ago, it's fulfilled, and his mind becomes like the mind of an animal until he looks up to heaven, and we catch up to where we began. We catch up to the present day now. And so there you have it. Marking out the text helps us to see the progression and the flow of the story. There's a lot of other things going on in this story, and that's not the full interpretation. But there's one thing, noticing the time references and how we begin at the end, flashback, and then work our way up to the present day. Hope that's been helpful, and I hope you tune in again for another time of Marking the Text.